Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta, I'm your host, and this is episode number 11 on the service road to becoming an elder. I've been thinking back over my podcast to this point, and I realize I've given out quite a bit of information about retirement with meaning, the second half of life, your elder years. And I was starting to present the various shifts that are important in the second half of life. The first one from doing to being, and the second one from competition to cooperation. And the result of my thinking is that I've decided to hold up a bit, take stock, slow down, and pick a clear direction for the work. So I took the time to decide what to emphasize at this point in the work. My overall goal, both for myself and for you, is to help us take advantage of the rich opportunities in the second half of life for growing and healing so that we can have a much better second half of life than our culture generally predicts for us. However, I didn't want this all to be just for ourselves, but that once we have it, that we also share it with others for the common good. And in the doing, would be creating a major part of the non-material legacy we want to leave behind us. So I mentioned growing, and a very legitimate question coming from that would be, well, growing how? I'll start by saying I'm not talking about a one-size-fits-all, but more about the possibilities and potentials that are here, and not dictates per se. Very importantly, I believe that the movement overall has to be spiritual, and I'll talk more about that at a different time. But that includes moving towards higher levels of consciousness as part of the growth. You've heard me give probably more than once now Albert Einstein's quote that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So there are a number of values in growing in consciousness. One practical one would be to be able to solve problems that will not be solved at a lower level of consciousness. I think the spiritual also involves contact with something transcendent, something mysterious. Hard to give exact words here, but something that somehow is above, somewhat beyond us, maybe our capability to understand or perceive. For many of us, it would be God. For people in 12-step programs, a lot of them, it might be higher power. But whatever it is in your faith or your belief system is all right. It will work for you. And no matter where you are, whether you don't have a particular faith system or even a belief system, you're welcome as long as you can feel you can get something here for your second half of life or your retirement. Another major part of the growth would be growing our person, coming to know and accept our true self. These things that I'm mentioning are certainly not ones I came up with all by myself, but are generally true across a spectrum of people who have written about, talked about, researched about the second half of life, aging, or elder years, or retirement. Another aspect of our growth can be to become the best version of us that we can be. Not necessarily what someone else wants us to be, but the best version of us that we can be. Very important also is to develop the qualities like character, integrity, wisdom, which unfortunately seem to be less in evidence in our polarized world and what's often a me-first world. And if elders aren't going to develop those kinds of qualities, who will? And I have to admit with some embarrassment that another possibility for our growing is growing up. I regret to say, even at this ripe age that I've reached, I can still find myself more than once a week saying, "Come on, Carm, grow up." There can be aspects of our personality from younger years or most of our life or all of our life that will get in the way of our own growth and then of being able to pass that growth on to others. I'll spare you other things I tell myself, but that should be enough to give you an idea. And a very big area of growth, I'll fall back on quoting Reb Zalman or Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who I've quoted before, that the movement in elders is away from personal ego and ambition towards contributing to the common good. And the movement is inward and deeper. You might also ask, why? Growing why? Why put in the kind of effort that this takes at this stage of our life, whether you find yourself at 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, or beyond? One reason I would say is because the payoff is very large for us, and therefore it can be for our families, for society, for the world. I'd also say we need transformed people, particularly transformed elders. A quote I heard maybe 15 years or so ago, which has stuck with me, was that information doesn't transform people. Transformed people transform people. And one of the big transformations available at this time, and possible and needed, is people who are no longer ego-driven, as in the first half of life, but service-driven. And I want to back up just a bit for a second and explain, in talking about transformation, we're talking about really a new being, a new entity, at least in some major respect or respects. I believe I've used my caterpillar example somewhere in the past, but probably a lot of you didn't listen to that podcast anyhow, so I'll use it again. When a caterpillar goes into its cocoon, if it could speak or think, it might say things like we do when we're on the verge of attempting to make some change, or of a change being likely to happen to us. What's going to happen? What will I be when I come out of here? Will I even like myself? Will others like me? Is it going to be hard? Is it going to be painful? Then the caterpillar emerges, but it's no longer a caterpillar. It's no longer crawling around through vegetation, maybe destroying somebody's garden at a pretty low level of consciousness. But now it has beautiful wings. It can fly. It can visit beautiful flowers. It becomes a pollinator. It's helpful instead of being destructive. And people even have a whole different reaction to this beautiful caterpillar flying around their garden. And to bring this example into the people world, I was recently told by a good friend about an experience one of her friends had in wanting to do some kind of volunteering. So she went to a food pantry to volunteer to help out there. But her experience was not good. She said the women who worked there were very cliquish, not very friendly, and they did not treat the people who came for food very well. This turned her off, and she didn't go back. But there was an environment that could have used an elder, or maybe two, so they'd be able to support each other. There was an environment that could use itself transforming. They were there to do something good, but apparently the way it was being done was not so good. It sounds, on little evidence, but you could surmise that maybe those people were there more for their own well-being than for the well-being of the people they were coming to serve. The new volunteer could still pass out food or stock shelves or unload trucks or whatever had to be done. But in the process, because of the quality of the being she brought to the job, because of the work she had done, and knowing about second half of life principles and the kinds of things that I've been talking about, could also have transformed that environment to a more caring, gentle place where the people who had to come there for food, instead of feeling bad going in there, could feel good coming out, could have felt kindness, attention, help, caring. And the other workers themselves would have grown in the process. That's the kind of thing that an elder can do. Another reason to take this time of our lives to grow is because the opportunities are so rich in the second half of life. And once we know them and once we know how to go about it, the possibilities for growth and good things happening are very rich. We can grow just for our own personal growth and whatever healing we might still need at this time of our life. The more we have of us, usually the better off we are, and the more we have to give to others. Many times people can feel selfish in taking care of themselves. I remember clients who would say things like, I should be home taking care of my baby. I shouldn't be here spending this time on myself. But I always tried to help people who were in that situation where they thought it was selfish to be doing something for themselves, that the more they have of themselves, the more they have to give. And if we don't take time for ourselves and we don't work on ourselves, then what we have to give people when we are drained, when we're spent, usually things like impatience, anger, bitterness, criticism, negativity, and so on. So when we're developing ourselves, we're really doing a good thing for just about anybody that we're going to come in contact with. And our own growth and healing can contribute to being good for everyone, from our family to our neighborhood, to our society, to the planet. So if you're still with me, there's important work along the way. And some of that work is the shifts that I've been talking about in past podcasts. For now, I'll limit myself to the two that I addressed earlier, the shift from doing to being and competition to cooperation. The shift from doing to being is going to require slowing down and coming to quiet. This is difficult for most of us, especially in the fast-paced world that we live in. In practical terms, it could mean coming to some terms with our television set or our smartphone. And I'm not talking about people who use television for companionship, shut-ins, or someone living alone who keeps the television set on for company, even if there's no program on that he or she is particularly interested in. I've mentioned Dr. Tversky before, who was the medical director and founder of the rehab that I worked at in my earlier career. When talking about addicts, he used to say, when they walk into an empty room, they immediately turn something on, a radio, television, their smartphone, because they realize they're in a room alone with someone they don't like very much. I'm not suggesting that you don't like yourself, but what I am suggesting here is that we're often uncomfortable with quiet, and our natural reaction is to break that quiet with something. So if you've been committing to or getting close to committing to your own growth, or possibly to sharing from your experience and wisdom, that if you don't already have a practice, you begin edging into it with maybe trying to create some solitude and quiet in each day if possible, or at least as many as you can reasonably squeeze in. You can do a little practice even on the go by not filling silences in conversation immediately with unnecessary speech. That really only serves to decrease our discomfort with the silence. And you can practice deepening the quality of your conversations. I don't mean every second that you have to be talking very seriously about deep subjects, but gathering an awareness of how many times we're often just sort of making noise, making sound, and what we're talking about is secondary to the sound that's being produced. I have only a brief infomercial today, and this would be a good spot to insert it. So I mainly wanted to say that if you've been listening to the podcast but have not checked out my Facebook page, Retirement with Meaning, I've been making small posts there that sometimes stand alone or sometimes reflect back to what was on the podcast. So you could reach those at Retirement with Meaning on Facebook. And vice versa, if you've been watching the post on Facebook but have not tuned into the podcasts appear right on my timeline in Facebook. And also, you can reach my podcast on YouTube by searching Carmen Aceta or Retirement with Meaning, and on my small website, Retirement with Meaning. And that's it for the infomercial, and we can get back to the business at hand. And that is, we can get back to the business at hand as soon as I tell you that website was retirementwithmeaning.com. In the doing to being shift, the willingness, the ability to go inward becomes very important. In the quiet and solitude, as much as possible, we pay attention to what's going on in our interior world, whether it's thoughts, feelings, our own self-talk, even physical state, like tightness of muscles, warmth, cold. And in the second half of life, for some people, you could call this a shift, I believe, is the ascendance of the importance of relationships. That relationships become more important to us. Many times they were neglected, particularly in the course of our careers and the other doing things that we had to do. And perhaps we had the power to not need to worry about relationships. We could just dictate. Whatever the case, we do things in a more relational way now, hopefully, and value relationships. And then for now, at least, I will sum up doing to being with the need for some sort of meditative practice. It can even be a moving meditative practice where you're doing something physical, but there's also a focus on the inside, or awareness or mindfulness, or whatever the case might be. In the other shift, the shift from competition to cooperation, submerging our ego, submerging our need to win becomes very important. And one factor that helps that shift to happen is when things are no longer all about me. And having moved away from competition, at least in certain areas, allows us to advocate for respectful processes, for relational processes, for what turns out to be win-win. We can mediate, hopefully soften, leaven the polarities that exist in any situation, whether it's a school board meeting or something else that's gotten rather rocky. We can become, in whatever environment we happen to be in the time, a sort of a benign leaven in what can be an increasingly polarized world. We can advocate for what's just, for the common good, or the public good, as we mentioned. And coming back to Reb Zalman again, he said, elders don't have the last word, they have the deep word. And part of that is because of what we've just been talking about. They don't need to have the last word. For one thing, they're not competing, their ego's not involved. And they have the deep word because they have spent time in silence. They have gone inward, they have reflected. They have taken into account the common good, not just their own. So let's do our own little shift here for a minute and shift away from competition to cooperation and look at the situation with eldering. And I'll start out with coming back to Reb Zalman again, who says, quote, eldering implies that we take responsibility for our destiny in old age. We not only take responsibility for our destiny, but we do the work necessary to give back to our society and the world from our accumulated experience and wisdom, end quotes. He says further that elders become teachers and mentors. These would be classic roles for elders, mediators, monitors, mobilizers away from self-interest and towards the common or public good. And I would add for emphasis that they not only do those things, but they do them in a second half of life in an elderly way. They bring their growth, their wisdom. They bring cooperation instead of competition. They leave their ego behind. Their interactions are driven by who we now are and not just what we do. Yes, we're doing things, but who we are is a very important part of that doing. It's what I mentioned earlier about the quality of the being that we bring to the doing. At this point, I'll stop adding content and begin to sum up some of the main points of the content I've given you. One being that the overall goal of this work is personal growth and healing as we need it. And then to employ that, plus our experience of a lifetime, to serve others for the common or the public good. And in that process, we'll be creating a good part of what our non-material legacy will be to our loved ones and others. I want to underline, too, the importance of the spirituality being a major factor in this work, particularly at this time of our lives, and the importance of moving to higher levels of consciousness. This time is, I guess, both an opportunity and a threat to come to know and accept our true self. James Garfield said, "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." I'd like to highlight also my hope, although it doesn't have to be your hope, that we're not only dealing with information here, but we're moving towards transformation and the large impact transformed people can have on their environments. In order to be elders serving the common good, we definitely have to make those shifts from doing to being, and competition to cooperation. An important part of those processes involves slowing down, coming to quiet, going inward, submerging our ego, not inserting your dollar and pulling out your product kind of work. And finally, I submit the importance of who we are, of who we bring to teaching or mentoring or mediating or monitoring or being mobilizers away from self-interest and towards the common or public good. Those are all driven by who we are and not just what we're doing. All right, then here's the summary after the summary. My goal is to help others and myself in the work of becoming elders and giving back to society and for the common good. If you can join me in that goal, it would be great. Support's very important. In fact, doing this podcast is a big part of my attempts to give back. Somewhere along the line, and after 30 years of having been a therapist, and reaching an age where George Burns used to say, "At my age, I don't buy green bananas anymore," I thought it would be a shame to die and that all the stuff that I've spent my life on and work that I knew had helped others along the way, that would be gone with me. So I wanted to find a way to give as much of it back as I could and kind of keep it in the mix where it could still do some good through others, and then they might do good with it. But if you can't join me in my goal, you're still welcome to take all you can for yourself and your own goals. And a lot of our eldering can occur in our own families and with our own loved ones, so you might still be making use of it. Also, if you're willing, you can still help the eldering cause by spreading the word about this resource, the podcast, if you find value in it. And for all those who do choose to participate for any reason, there's no one-size-fits-all to this. You can step in wherever it's comfortable for you, wherever it draws you somehow, with whatever resonates with you. It's your call. And I especially invite you to bring your own unique self to whatever eldering work you wind up doing. You can assimilate or integrate any new stuff you learn as nuances of who you are already, or parts of the transformed you, or at least the on the way to being transformed you. What you end up giving out of your own growth and experience and wisdom will be part of your, what I call, non-material legacy. I usually end with a goodbye and normally a quote or a little poem or something that's connected with what I've been talking about. I'm going to switch that up a bit today and address particularly people who might be having some difficulty at this second half of lifetime, retirement years. But I want to say that we have the opportunity to live much fuller lives in our elder years than what's predicted for us if we're willing to work at it at whatever level we can, and we're willing to use support. And that we don't need to exclude ourselves even because of difficulties or illness or suffering. We don't seem to be able to avoid suffering in this world. But with support, we can have the opportunity to live with meaning and even happiness in the face of suffering. Not saying it's easy. It can take some heroic effort. However, no matter your circumstances, you're invited to tap into this at whatever level or degree you can and with whatever energy you can bring to it. You're certainly welcome. And even if your mobility is limited, you can find ways to help the cause in whatever way you uniquely can. In fact, next time I'll see if I can work in a story about someone I know personally and have known for a long time, who is a good example of someone with some difficulties in her life, but who still makes an impact and lives with meaning. So in bringing this show to a close, I want to thank you for listening. And in place of the little quote that I usually use, I'm going to share some definitions of vital or vitality that I looked up. One is full of life and vigor, lively and animated character, tending to renew or refresh living, invigorating, highly developed physical or mental vigor. And pay attention to this one. The peculiarity distinguishing the living from the non-living.